So this is going to be a different video than what you're probably used to, since this is going to be a list video. And this video is going to be a list of the bad decks that were just so bad that I couldn't get to work. And these were decks that were so terrible that despite my best efforts, they just couldn't work. And I'll give a little bit of context along with some brief estimations as to when I try to build these decks, just so that you can get a feel for what I was trying to build. But before I start the video, feel free to like, comment, and share this video, and feel free to check out my other videos, and feel free to subscribe if you really like my content. But without any further ado, let's get into it. So, first up on this list are GenXs, and GenXs are really the inspiration behind this video, since it's the deck that I remember the most, and it's probably the deck that I put the most effort into. Now, I thought I could make this deck work since I tried using generically good machine support, and cards like Cyber Dragon and Machina Fortress were great candidates at the time since I was building GenXs at the height of the 5Ds era. And the idea was that I would rely on things like machine duplication to spam out things like Card Trooper and Darksea Rescue for synchro material. And I tried to use these synchros to hold me over until I could get my main GenX synchros out. However, I soon figured out that I would be getting a lot of bad opening hands, since I was using a real mismatch of cards. And the second problem was that GenXs didn't have a solid unifying strategy that effectively allowed them to search out their key cards. GenXs also lacked draw power, which stunned their access to resources, and they also had issues with effectively special summoning out their monsters so that they could get their combos going. I tried using things like GenX Ally Duradark and GenX Ally Remote, but it barely made a difference since the main GenX synchros had to be summoned out with a specific attribute GenX monster, which was problematic since GenXs already had special summoning issues. And despite using GenX Ally Chemister, the combination between the summoning issues and the attribute issues, it just made GenXs very impossible to play altogether. The next deck on this list involves Earthbound Immortals. So like GenXs, this was a deck that I really wanted to work, since I love the whole aesthetic behind Earthbound Immortals. I began by building the deck by using cards like Earthbound Immortal Kokopakapu, Uru, Asilapisku, and Wiracocha. I understood that I couldn't fit all of them into the deck since it would cause huge bricking issues, so I decided to stick with these Earthbound Immortals, since they were the ones that had some of the better effects. And I mainly try to use cards like Mausoleum of the Emperor, Beast King Barbados, Double Summon, and things like Cyber Dragon for easy summons, since Earthbound Immortals were very tribute summon based. But despite these stellar cards, I quickly noticed that Earthbound Immortals had a summoning issue, despite being able to summon out these smaller monsters. I noticed that I wound up having to give up more monsters than I would get back for the Earthbound Immortals summon. So basically, I had to tribute 2 monsters for 1 Earthbound Immortal. So I was losing more card advantage and more card economy than I was getting back. And it was worse that you could only have 1 Earthbound Immortal on the field, and there had to be 1 field spell in order to keep it on the board. And these 2 stipulations were such a handicap to your strategy, and it stung when your opponent would destroy your field spell so that it would instantly destroy your Earthbound Immortal. The strategy was just so unrealistic. It was easy to dismantle, and you invested way too much in order to get so little gain. Now this next deck is a mix between 2 decks that I really wanted to get to work, and it had some potential, but it ultimately fell short. And the deck that I tried making was a mix between Malefics and Mechlords, and I wound up nicknaming the deck Malefic Mechlords. I understood that the 2 decks were too non-functional to work on their own, so I decided mixing the 2. I recognized that Malefics had the same flaws like Earthbound Immortals, and they would brick in your hand since you couldn't easily summon them out, and you needed a field spell to keep them on the board, but because they would be destroyed upon there being no field spells, I thought it would be a great opportunity to throw in Mechlords into the mix. And I thought it was a good idea to use Mechlords, since Mechlords are summoned out when one of your monsters were destroyed by a card effect. And I figured that the Malefic monster's destruction upon the field spell being destroyed would be the perfect rebound so that I could have a backup monster on the field. And in this case, the backup monster would be the Mechlord. So I thought it was the perfect way to make up for Malefic's shortcomings, at least from the field spell situation. And this is what gave Malefic Mechlords the most viability out of all the decks that I've listed before. And field spells like Malefic World allowed you to search out one Malefic monster at the cost of doing your regular draw phase. And although Malefic Mechlords allowed you to search out key monsters like Malefic Cyber End Dragon and Malefic Stardust Dragon by using Malefic World, it wasn't enough. The deck still had bricking issues, since you couldn't quickly normal or special summon Malefics or Mechlords besides fulfilling their mandatory summoning conditions. However, things like Mechlord Army monsters gave you this much needed normal summon, and Mechlord Army of Skill allowed you to summon out other Mechlord Army monsters upon being destroyed by battle and being sent to the graveyard. But despite some promise, Malefics and Mechlords had some inherent handicaps, much like Earthbound Immortals had, where you couldn't have more than one face-up Malefic monster on the field, or you couldn't attack with any other monsters besides the specific Mechlord you had on the field. And you could potentially lock yourself out of attacks if you had more than one Mechlord on the field. So, although this deck had some strengths, it had too many conditions like this holding it back. I know cards like Chaos Infinity helped you summon out huge beaters like Astromechanical, and yes, it did help you set up for a Mechlord summon by destroying the monster that was summoned by Infinity's effect, but it did usually result in you having a smaller field presence, since Mechlords only allowed you to attack with one specific Mechlord, or you could only have one Malefic out on the field because of their restriction. And it meant that you usually had about 2 monsters out on the field for the most part. And it also meant that it was easier for your opponent to pick apart your field and outpace you with card advantage. And it was worse if your opponent had a bunch of destruction effects. So, while Malefics had some promise back in the day, they fell short specifically because of their lack of consistency. But yeah, these have been the decks that I've tried my darndest in making them work. And it's really a shame because I want to see all of these decks succeed, and I really like all of them. And I know Mechlords have received some semi-recent support within the past year, and it's honestly part of the reason why I want to revisit that deck at a later time. And hopefully these other decks get some recent support like Mechlords, and I hope it's good support in general. But with that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this, you can do so via donation on my Cash App. I need to resolve some issues with my Patreon, but I still post on there, and you can still catch my content on that same page. But for the meantime, you can help me out on Cash App by finding me at the Necromancer1040 Cash App tag. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next video. Alright, take care.